Hello everyone, and welcome back to Checkmate Atun-Shei, the series where I calmly critique the callous content creators' infamous series, Checkmate Lincolnites by Atun-Shei Films. In the previous episode, I was deeply troubled by his behavior and the things he had to say. However, in this episode, I didn't come out of it with a sense of sheer disgust for the man. Rather, this time, I came out of the episode with a profound sense of boredom. The title for this episode is Tariffs and Taxes, the Real Cause of the Civil War? This episode's topic is a complex one, as the matter of tariffs and taxes is a convoluted web of economics, logistics, and politics. As someone who understands this, it's not a subject that can be grossly simplified without missing out on major factors that can contribute to the issue. However, for my impression of Atun-Shei thus far, I highly doubt he will give the subject the credit that it's due. Will he surprise me and actually put some proper effort into explaining the matter, or will he let me down harder than McDonald's not giving a kid his chicken nuggies? I'm willing to bet it's the latter. But we will only know by watching this, aneurysm-inducing series. So, let's begin. The episode begins with much the same typical opening style that I've grown accustomed to with Atun-Shei's videos. The extremely boring anti-comedy and vain attempts at humor to try to sweeten the deal. However, it just comes off as unnecessary filler, extending an otherwise 7-minute long video by an additional 2 minutes, not including the long outro for the video, which adds another minute. In other words, about 30% of the total video has little to nothing of value to add, making it a considerable waste of time and an outright bore. It's an absolute waste of...
Pete? Are you talking about this dumb again?
Oh, Mister Neigh-Neigh, I wasn't expecting...
He's a dumb who wastes your time!
Well, yeah, obviously enough.
So why do you keep talking about this dumb so much?
Well, to put it simply, it's because of his ideas, for whatever reason, have inertia with an audience seemingly unaware of how truly bad they are. Without any sense of irony, people actually believe this guy is entertaining.
Wow! P.T. Barnum was right when he told me that a dumb was born every minute.
Isn't it meant to be a sucker's born every minute?
No, I knew him.
But how could you know him if you're just a figment of my imagination and gradually eroding sanity? Also, aren't you a ketamine addict?
That's what you think, Boots, but I'm deathly real. Deathly real. Alright, Mr. Boots, I'm about to head out.
Wait, you're not going to stay in...
Nope. Last time I did that, I died from cringe. So I've got better things to do. Catch you on the flip side, Bootsy.
Well, all I can say is Mister Neigh-Neigh is correct. He does waste my time, and the time of many people who know better than what he does with his terrible ideas and unimaginative content. The only reason why I'm even responding to his content is because his content is popular and widely distributed as some form of objective fact, even though I keep on seeing obvious and self-evident flaws with his videos. It's those rubbish ideas that gets him labeled as a BritTuber by those with a bit more common sense. Speaking of BritTuber, this is one of the points he brings up in his 2 minutes of life-wasting content, which he oversimplifies down to liberals who make YouTube videos. This tiny bit of information might not seem important, but it does offer us a small glimpse into his political leanings. For those not aware, BritTube refers to a collective group of left-wing YouTube channels that promote broadly progressive content, usually promoting the ideology of communism. This last part being where the term BritTube comes from, as it references Russian anarcho-communist Peter Kropotkin's book, The Conquest of Bread. The fact he considers the label of breadtuber to apply to people he considers to simply be liberal shows us that his Overton window is much further to the left than what might initially be thought. This suspicion is only further raised when you remember the viewpoints he pushed in the previous videos and his radical, inflammatory rhetoric on the topic of the war. After listening to that, he then struggles to open the plastic wrapping around a whiskey bottle. This was probably some attempt at humor, but this came off as a reflection of a sense of weakness and severe lack of masculinity. At about the 2-minute mark, Atun-Shei decides to explain why he has a bottle of whiskey to his sleep paralysis demon made into a straw man, Johnny Reb. He wants to play a little game called the Whataboutism drinking game, where he states that if Johnny Reb deflects from the conversation by pointing out something bad that the Union did, he'd take a shot of whiskey. I found this to be rather demeaning, especially when we remember that he is the one selecting random comments to put into Johnny Reb's mouth. This is the classic form of strawman argumentation at its most blatant. And yet, people defend this content and champion it as good, including people who ought know better than this. It's not until 2 minutes and 15 seconds into the video, nearly a quarter of the way through the whole video, that we finally get the intro to the series. Mind you, the video is a grand total of 10 minutes 48 seconds long, including the outro, which hogs up another minute of the video time. And all of that time, nothing has been set up properly, nor has anything of value been added to the video. It's not entertaining, it's not informative, but it sure is a waste of time. Almost as if it was designed to drive up the video length to encourage it further in the algorithm or something. In either case, in the intro, Johnny Reb makes the point that this series is about annihilating academic historical consensus to reveal true history. Ironically enough, this statement, which is meant to be construed as a negative statement, is in fact relevant. Academic historical consensus is a dangerous thing, as it often does exclude the truth or muddy the waters of the truth by attempting to promote a correct interpretation of historical events. This is self-evident with the discussion of biblical history and the ongoing conflict between the biblical minimalists and the biblical maximalists, wherein both sides have differing views of how to interpret the historical events of the Bible. About 3 decades ago, the near-unanimous consensus was that of a biblical minimalist viewpoint, wherein most of the historical events of the Bible were fictitious accounts written during the Babylonian exile and by anonymous sources as per the documentary hypothesis. This was particularly popular among the atheistic scholars and intellectuals who used this viewpoint to affirm their atheistic beliefs. However, in recent times, there has been a growing minority of historians who have challenged this notion in various forms, as well as solid evidence affirming passages in the Old Testament as having taken place. In other words, the academic historical consensus is not necessarily the truth, but simply an agreed-upon position by the academic community. It should not be viewed as absolute fact and should be actively questioned, scrutinized, and re-evaluated in order to prevent it from becoming a dogma. It's not until nearly 3 minutes into the video that we finally delve into the main topic of this video, the question of taxation and tariffs and its role in the war. The first comment presented actually states a statistic offered up by the book The Real Lincoln, a new look at Abraham Lincoln, his agenda, and an unnecessary war, by Dr. Thomas J. De Lorenzo, a specialist and professor of economics, which was published in 2002. In the book, De Lorenzo is extremely critical of Lincoln's overall policies and, rightfully, criticizes him where he is due criticism, to which the wider historical community also rightfully criticized his work. Due to his economic background, it's likely he was able to figure out a method of calculating the stated figure. But, unfortunately, I do not have this book in my possession to provide further commentary on. In other words, it's not likely to be a statistic conjured up out of nowhere, but does likely have some basis, which I may have an explanation for later on. Initially, Atun-Shei was confused by this statement, which, frankly, I cannot say is unwarranted, as it is a bit of an out-of-left-field statement without the provided context needed. However, once he processes it, he claims that it isn't true and begins to cite from the annual report of the Chamber of Commerce of the state of New York, in which he shows that nearly 2/3 of the overall tariffs were collected in the state of New York. From this, he attempts to argue that it was the New York merchants paying said tariffs, and, more likely than not, attempting to argue that the South weren't the ones footing the bill. However, there's a massive issue with this entire line of argumentation. Namely, he does not understand how tariffs function and who exactly ends up footing the bill for said tariffs. Firstly, let's address why New York was contributing to 63.5% of all tariff revenue. The reason why comes down to one location: New York City. New York City, according to the 1860 census, had a population of over 850,000 people, making it the largest city in the United States at the time. This large population existed because New York City was a major port city, which acted as the main dropping-off point for most finished goods coming from Europe and the final port of call before merchant vessels began their journey back across the Atlantic to England. As a result, the city was a major economic hub, which saw the transaction of foreign goods into the city and the exportation of raw resources, such as tobacco from Virginia, to the European nations like the United Kingdom. Secondly, we need to discuss who exactly foots the bills for a tariff. If we look at Investopedia's website, we can see that they have a definition for what a tariff is, an explanation for why tariffs are enacted, and the negative side effects of a tariff. Some of those reasons relevant to the discussion are as follows. Number 1. The tariff causes the price of foreign goods to go up, which is reflected in the end cost for the consumer. Just as with any tax on a good, the end cost is paid for by the consumer. Number 2. It removes competition, which can also drive up the price of goods. This inevitably will create things like oligopolies and regional monopolies. Number 3. It can favor certain industries in certain regions while detrimentally hurting other regions. For example, a tariff can benefit manufacturers in a major urban city, but detrimentally hurt consumers in rural areas. All of these issues culminate in instigating internal conflict. In the case of the United States in the mid-19th century, the South's largely agrarian economy made it dependent on foreign trade as a means of acquiring finished goods, which, in exchange, it provided necessary raw materials to keep the major industrial mills in England going. Cotton, in particular, was a vital resource of trade to keep the textile mills in Manchester going. By contrast, the North's more industrialized centers, such as those in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and the regions around the Great Lakes, heavily favored these tariffs as a means of protecting those industries, which detrimentally hurt the Southern economy by driving up the price of goods. Third, and finally, we need to take a look into the importance of New York City for the Southern states and their import economies. New York City wasn't just a major port city, but acted as a major stopping point for the transportation of goods to and from the city. Extensive railroad connections had already cropped up around the city, but the most prominent form of transportation of goods to and from the city was by boat. For example, the Erie Canal, which was, at the time, one of the largest engineering feats conducted by mankind, connected up the city to the Great Lakes region, facilitating the transportation of goods into the Great Lakes region and to cities like Buffalo, Toledo, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Chicago. However, there was also trade going up and down the Atlantic coast to southern port cities. In Virginia, the Old Dominion Steamship Company was a pre-war shipping company which ran a route from Virginia's many small-time ports to New York City. One vessel in their fleet, the Yorktown, was a side-paddle steamship built in 1859 for the specific purpose of steaming from Richmond, Virginia, to New York City to ferry passengers and cargo to and from the major urban center. In fact, many of the merchant vessels commandeered by the Confederate Navy at the start of the war were often designed to run these coastal routes from southern ports to New York City. The Yorktown happened to be commandeered herself and renamed the CSS Patrick Henry. Many southern port towns, like City Point, Virginia, and West Point, Virginia, and the railway lines connecting them to their respective cities, Petersburg and Richmond respectively, were built specifically to facilitate the interstate coastal trade routes to and from New York City to export tobacco and other cash crops while importing finished goods from Europe via New York City. The entire system of logistics was centered on using New York City as a major trading port, which is why the tariffs appear in New York City and not predominantly in southern port cities. However, as stated earlier, the costs of the tariffs would eventually fall upon the consumer as they are the ones who end up paying for the goods in question. In other words, the cost of all of these tariffs would eventually fall upon the southern states, even though it's being paid for initially by the merchantmen in New York City because the tariffs drive up the final cost of goods in question. The South were the ones paying for the tariffs, not the merchantmen in New York City. That is why the southern population and many southern elites were concerned about major tariff hikes. In the end, they were the ones who'd have to pay for it because they were the end consumer, while the northern industries were the ones who benefited from it. After bringing this statistic up, and ignoring the overall issues with it, he goes on to discuss the Morel tariff, its intentions, and, for once, he actually agrees with something the Southerners have to say. Namely, he talks about how it was intended to jumpstart the economy after the Panic of 1858, while Johnny Reb retorts how it only benefited the North and neglected the South. However, what's worth noting here is he forgets a major key component of the entire issue with the Morel tariff: its basis in faulty economic theory. The entire idea of protectional tariffs in U.S. politics comes from Alexander Hamilton, who, at the same time he pushed these tariffs, also promoted extensive centralization of the federal body of government in order to facilitate the development of industry. This, of course, ran against the South's Jeffersonian concept of the Farmers' Republic, which advocated for less centralization of the political system. However, as anyone who's been through any economic courses would know by now, tariffs are a terrible idea for jump-starting the economy. Tariffs, ultimately, are not sound economic policy as they cause price inflation for consumers and, if they become too extreme, can result in a trade war. A trade war, in the simplest of terms, is where two nations impose increasing levels of economic sanctions, often in the form of tariffs or embargoes on goods from those countries, as an expression of hostility towards them for various reasons. A trade war is terrible for an economic system like that of the South, as the South's wealth was dependent on the exportation of raw goods in favor of the importation of finished goods. What the North wanted was, in many regards, a threat to the Southern economy and could have led to an economic panic, i.e., a recession. This is a manifestation of the overall problem with the two regions. both had vastly different economic systems that were reliant on different styles of trade from one another, largely instigated by the environmental factors that made these regions possible. The South's agrarianism was due to the abundance of fertile land, making it ripe for the planting and growing of major cash crops, such as tobacco, cotton, indigo, and so on, for exportation. This eventually led to the South's founding fathers, such as Thomas Jefferson, favoring an agrarian-oriented political system, which would be decentralized. By contrast, the mineral-rich regions in the north, such as Pennsylvania and Michigan, combined with a colder climate and less farmland, lent itself towards industrialism, which is reflected in the mindset of their founding fathers, such as Alexander Hamilton, that would advocate for greater centralization of authority in order to protect said industry. In the end, both sides were geared to conflict with one another, regardless of the topic at hand, as both had vastly different approaches of viewing the same problem, even though both groups were descended from the same motherland, England. However, this entire point is often ignored, and not just by Atun-Shei, but by most everyone when talking about the complexity of the overall conflict. He then tries to add the stipulation that the Morrill Tariff wasn't passed until March 1861, which was only after a number of southern states had seceded, arguing that if they hadn't seceded, the tariff likely wouldn't have passed. However, there's an issue with this assumption. John C. Calhoun also made a similar assumption about the New England delegation, which he assumed would not pass the tariff of 1828, only to be proven incorrect as more delegates ended up voting for it than he originally assumed. The issue with his assumption is he is assuming they would vote based purely on party lines. This is an issue because it presumes that the Democratic Party of 1860 was a united front. It was, obviously enough, not. Though they were primarily divided over how to best handle the slavery debate of the time, this is not exclusive to that debate either. Namely, in the election of 1860, there were a grand total of 4 political parties running presidential candidates, 3 of which consisted largely of Democrats. You had Stephen Douglas of the Democratic Party proper, John C. Breckinridge of the Southern Democratic Party, and John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, a party consisting of former Whigs, Know-Nothing Party members, and Democrats. To assert that a particular outcome would have occurred is faulty logic, as it ignores the division within the Democratic Party at this time. This also ignores that the tariff was already passed by the House, which was soundly against the Southern interests at this time due to the dramatic demographic shift favoring the North. There's also the inconvenient fact that Lincoln was elected president, a man who promoted the tariff as a means of securing the states of Pennsylvania and New Jersey during this election. In other words, it is not at all a guarantee that the bill would not have passed, as those who make this broad assumption fail to grasp the fickle nature of politics and politicians. He then goes on to address another comment, which I have shown here, by discussing more about the British newspapers and their propagation of the quote-unquote myth of the war being fought over taxation. The issue is that it isn't a myth. A part of the reason why states such as Georgia seceded from the Union came down to their complaints over issues such as the usage of taxes from southern states to help fund projects in the North, a matter which was explicitly addressed with the alterations made to the U.S. Constitution that would later become the Confederate Constitution. In other words, this was a reason for why the South seceded in part. Ironically enough, what the comment gets completely right is acknowledging the factor Atun-Shei and most modern historians simply refuse to admit. The war was far more complex than they wished to give it credit for being. There were multiple reasons for why the conflict came about, which stem from the deep rift between the social, economic, political, and environmental backgrounds of the northern and southern states. However, instead of acknowledging this reality, Atun-Shei, and likewise many modern historians, turn to their version of the complex cause fallacy, trying to explain everything through the lens of slavery, their reductio ad servitudum. More specifically, he references John Stuart Mills in his commentary on the matter of the war, in which he describes that the sole cause for the war was that of slavery. The entire issue with this is it presumes that John Stuart Mills had a strong understanding of the mindset of the country at the time, rather than his own opinions largely being based on the material culture he read. It assumes a sense of infallibility from his position, which he affirms by trying to argue that the Emancipation Proclamation made the war into a righteous cause against slavery because the North wanted it, something that is demonstrably false, rather than it existing to explicitly keep the British out of the conflict as a political move. In this case of bringing up an English politician, I seek to bring up my own Englishman who, unlike Mills, actually visited America and came to learn a great deal about the American mindset through his interactions there. This man is one I've referenced several times before in this series, G.K. Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton, after having visited America in the early 20th century, published a book in 1922 titled What I Saw in America. In it, he describes his experiences of going to the United States and touring through the country. One particular chapter from this book is entitled Lincoln and Lost Causes, which addresses much of the historical narrative of the South while also providing some insightful commentary on the gross ignorance of Chesterton's own countrymen when it came to understanding U.S. politics and its history. I would like to quote the first couple paragraphs to help illustrate exactly what I mean. It has already been remarked here that the English know a great deal about past American literature, but nothing about past American history. They do not know either, of course, as well as they know the present American advertising, which is the least important of the three. But it is worth noting once more how little they know of the history, and how illogically that little is chosen. They have heard, no doubt, of the fame of the greatness of Henry Clay. He is a cigar. But who would be unwise to cross-examine any Englishman who may be consuming that luxury at that moment about the Missouri Compromise or the controversies with Andrew Jackson? And just as the statesman of Kentucky is a cigar, so is the state of Virginia is a cigarette. But there is perhaps one exception, or half-exception, to the simple plan. It would perhaps be an exaggeration to say that Plymouth Rock is a chicken. Any English person keeping chickens, and chiefly interested in Plymouth Rocks considered as chickens, would nevertheless have a hazy sensation of having seen that word somewhere before. He would feel subconsciously that the Plymouth Rock had not always been a chicken. Indeed, the name connotates something not only solid, but antiquated, and is not therefore a very tactful name for a chicken. There would rise up before him something memorable in the haze that he calls his history, and he would see the history books of his boyhood, and old engravings of men in steeple-crowned hats struggling with sea waves or red Indians. The whole thing would suddenly become clear to him if, by a simple reform, the chickens were called Pilgrim Fathers. My reason for mentioning this is quite simple. Just because an Englishman said the war was about slavery does not necessarily make the position correct. After all, his basis for this could just as easily be simplified by the information he heard these things from, or merely paying attention to simply one aspect. It's the overall ignorance of those outside of the system, who have little to no engagement with it outside of what they read from a newspaper, who ultimately fail to understand the problem at hand. It's even worth noting that those within the system can also fail to understand the scope of the situation at hand, as we see with the quote brought up by Atun-Shei from John C. Calhoun. He brings up this specific quote about Calhoun's argumentation that the tariff crisis is simply an extension of the slavery crisis. The issue with this is merely John C. Calhoun's opinion. He simply thought of the nullification crisis as an extension of the slavery debate, but when you look at it with the understanding of how deeply divided the two sides were irrespective of the slavery debate, then there's no doubt that the matter wasn't merely an extension of the slavery debate. Rather, the nullification crisis was a manifestation of the deep ideological rift that had developed as a consequence of the background of these two regions of the nation. The South's agrarianism, something that existed regardless of the existence of slavery, would inevitably come into conflict with the North's urbanism and industrialist policies. There was an undercurrent of competing interests between the North and South, which aided in bringing about the war and existed outside of the realm of slavery. Take Matthew Fontaine Maury as a golden example. Maury, a Virginian with a prestigious scientific and naval career, was a proponent of the form of abolition proposed by the likes of Abraham Lincoln, i.e., the freeing of slaves and emigration of freed slaves to colony nations. But he also promoted Southern interests. More specifically, he was an advocate for the Transcontinental Railroad to start in the southern states and travel westward, an idea he and other Southerners of his time supported. Yet, when the secession crisis came and Virginia seceded from the Union, he ended up resigning his commission in the United States Naval Academy and was commissioned within the Confederate Navy. Even though he was not at all a proponent of slavery and held much the same opinion as Abraham Lincoln when it came to the slavery debate, he ended up siding with the Confederacy because he had motivations to join outside of defending an institution. To put it simply, the entire matter cannot be summarized through the reductio ad subvertutum commonly used by Atun-Shei and modern historians. Simply referring to particular people's opinions does not necessitate the overall reason for why such conflicts break out. This form of reduction would be no different than me trivializing the First World War down to some angry Serb LARPer decided to shoot the Archduke one day. It's only true in the sense that it was the spark that caused the First World War. However, it would leave out key pieces of information that explain why an angry Serb LARPer shooting an Archduke could even be construed as the cause for a war between the major European powers. The American Civil War was not a one-cause affair. Slavery was a contributing factor, yes, but so were tariffs, the ideological division between North and South, the economic system of the North and South, the environmental factors that helped shape those views, their differing social systems that go as far back as their founding, the rapidly shifting demographics causing the severe disparity between the two powers, the lack of any unifying leaders, and so on and so forth. In the end, no one can simplify the conflict down to a one-note affair. Doing so not only diminishes the true complexity of the events that happened, but can lead to ideologically poisonous views that can, and have, manifest themselves into hatred and vitriol against fellow man. In conclusion, though this video did not get the same rise out of me as the previous two videos, it is simply poorly researched, if not deliberately misleading. Tariffs and taxes were a critical debate topic of the time, just as they always have been and always will be. They alone may not offer enough of an explanation for why the war took place, but that does not mean there isn't merit in analyzing them. They were, and still are, an issue, which, the more we are willing to discuss them and how deeply they impact other regions, the more likely we are to avert instigating conflicts that claim the lives of countless innocent men.